With its 260 institutes in 9 faculties, RWTH Aachen University is among the leading European scientific and research institutions. Over 40,000 students from more than 120 countries are currently enrolled in over 100 courses of study. The work of the research centers of RWTH Aachen is closely oriented towards the current needs of the industry. This results in numerous patents and startups, and was also the deciding factor for international research institutions such as Microsoft and Ford to be set up in the Aachen region. Professor Malte Brettel is Vice Rector for Business and Industry Relations and Head of the Chair for Innovation and Entrepreneurship and its adjacent Center for Entrepreneurship. He is strongly interested in questions important to innovators and business founders, meaning research topics that are on the intersection of theory and practice. Consequently, he puts strong emphasis on application-oriented and participant-centered teaching approaches, such as case-based discussions, video lectures, or online simulations. Learning techniques that are meant to enable students of RWTH to be experts in technology and become future business leaders.
Let's go over to the first assignment, and before we do this, I'd like to give you an introduction to effectuation, which is the entrepreneurial way of thinking and acting that you as a student can use, that professors can use, that people in entrepreneurial company, established companies can use to be more entrepreneurial, more efficient, more effective in what they do. Have you ever asked yourself why in some situations startups are more successful than established companies? Take the example of Skype versus Siemens. Both companies, especially Siemens, had all the technologies to realize voice over IP, so telephoning in the internet. However, it was Skype, a startup, who basically made the race and is, if you look at the number of minutes, the biggest telephone company in the world right now. Why hasn't this been Siemens? And they had the technologies. And the other example is the Streetscooter. Why is it possible at RWTH Aachen University that a professor, a single professor with the help of other professors, comes up with a Streetscooter, with an electric vehicle? And there's so many established companies, automotive companies, that can also do the same thing. Well, part of that, the reason why this is possible is effectuation, the entrepreneurial way of thinking and acting, which makes you realizing those things with very, very little means. And I'd like to give you an introduction into that, and the assignment is also about this. So let's start first of all with the basis. The basis is this lady. This lady, a very entrepreneurial personality, she asked herself when coming to the US, starting her PhD, if expert entrepreneurs have a different way of solving problems. Do they deal with risks and returns, especially in highly uncertain situations, differently than non-expert entrepreneurs, people in established companies? And those highly uncertain situations are very typical for Streetscooter and also for voice over IP, because nobody knew whether this is possible, the technology will have a breakthrough and all this stuff. And what she did, she examined 27 expert entrepreneurs in form of think aloud experiment, and she basically found out as a result that they have a different approach to solving problems, the expert entrepreneurs. And what is the different approach? So first of all, let's look at the approach you learn in a business school, and which is true for many situations, which you should use for many situations. The first thing you do is you build your goals. And then you think about the process to achieve the goals, and then you collect the means, and this is how you do your plan. Question: if you can't predict, if you can't build a goal, what do you do then? You can't plan if you can't predict, so you can't define goals. So the non-entrepreneurial way, the established way in normal settings is you define goals. Based on goals, you look at the process and the means, you look at expected returns and so on. This is totally right for all of the established companies. However, in those uncertain situations, like Streetscooter, was it not possible to predict the future of electric mobility? Expert entrepreneurs have a different approach because they say we can't predict, so we don't predict, we do it differently. And what's their different approach? Basically, the different approach is they start with their means. They start with their person, with the question, who am I, what do I know, and whom do I know? So Achim Kamka's starting point was exactly that. And then he asked himself, what can I do with who I am, what I know, and whom I know? And he could do certain things. However, to go further, to build an electric vehicle, he had to approach others. And with these others, he had to craft so-called stakeholder commitments. So taking more means and getting more new goals in order to build the Streetscooter, in order to create his company and also create the market he has created. So this is basically a cycle which you go through in several ways. And what you do is you always have a starting point. This is your situation right now. Then you think about what you can do in this situation. You take others in your boat, so to say, and you have a new output. And by doing that stepwise, you don't need to predict your future, but you create the future. And this is the typical process entrepreneurs go. So they start with the input, then they can go a certain process, and this is the result is they create an output. They don't predict, they create the output. And in highly uncertain situations, this is by far the better way to act, because you control the future and you design your own future for your own success. So what is the difference to established processes? Let's take 4 logic dimensions and compare the causal logic, so the logic where you predict the goal and so on, to the effectual logic, the action-based approach. What's the starting point again? The starting point is, in the causal logic, it's your goals. It is the output. You predict the output. The starting point in the effectual logic are your own means, is where you are. What are you able to do at this point of time? The second, the investment decision, is now the expected returns. If I would like to reach the output, what kind of process do I need? What's my input? And what is my return? Calculating what I have to put in and comparing that to what's the output is. In the effectual way, you commit a limit. You say, okay, what am I willing to lose, which is your affordable loss, in the next step, and how far do I get doing that? Which is a different approach, and exactly this is why entrepreneurs are more efficient in coping with uncertainty, because they only commit certain limits and they look how far they got, and if they don't get further, they stop earlier. Next step is the process, the next logic dimension. If you can predict, you should predict, you plan, you do research for your plans, and you execute your plans. In the effectual logic, you basically craft stakeholder commitments. So you try to commit more and more stakeholders into your, we call it crazy quilt. A quilt having more than in the case of Streetscooter, 40 companies bringing their expertise into the Streetscooter. And the last one is, how do you deal with contingencies? Well, if you made your plan, you'd like to stick to your plan, so you try to avoid surprises. On the other hand, in the effectual logic, you leverage the contingencies. If something happens on your way, you try to put it into your crazy quilt and use it for your advantage. And this is again why entrepreneurs could be more successful. But I'm always talking about entrepreneurs. This process, this effectual process, really holds true for many people, for all of us in uncertain situations. In uncertain situations, it's better to solve the situation stepwise than to try to predict what could happen in the future, because this is just not possible. So let's look at some instruments you can use to go the effectual process. One of the first and important instrument is to analyze yourself, analyze your skills, your knowledge, as well as the settings in which you would like to use your skills and knowledge. So what you do if you do that first step of effectuation, you first of all access your own means in terms of understanding your strengths and understanding what you're good at. Then the second step is reflecting those means and trying to understand the context in which you used your strengths. Because this is probably the best context also in the future to use your strengths. And you also ask yourself which skills and knowledge were needed in these situations in order to have a sense for potential stakeholders you should commit into your crazy quilt in order to be more successful. And when you've done that, the third step is now you transfer your means to the new situation, to the situation you'd like to create, to the situation of creating a street scooter, to the situation of creating a telephone company like Skype or other entrepreneurial situations. In which context do you want to apply the skills and knowledge, and which is the closest context for me to use my skills and knowledge in order to be good at what you're doing in terms of like combining the best resource you have for the best result, potential result in the future. This also gives you a hint for skills and knowledge lacking in that situation, which is the second step in order to go to craft stakeholder commitments. So that's the first instrument, and the next instrument exactly about partnerships, about crafting stakeholder commitments. Because if you have a sense for the strengths and the knowledge you need in your as your next step in your crazy quilt, you might think about your partnerships. You might think about this crazy quilt. Is it more a string quartet? Actually, this is not a string quartet. This is a couple more musicians. Or a jam session. This is also not a jam session. This is obviously more a guitar round. However, did you really put it together and have like notes they play at, or do they just do a jam session, play whatever they think that comes into their mind? However, also a jam session is to some extent under control of some leader, or at least a piece they'd like to do together. So what is the partnership you would like to create? This is the main question you're trying to answer. And why do you need to commit partners? What is the advantage of that? As I said before, it's the skills and the knowledge. It is new ideas you get into your quilt. It's resources. It is growth potential, because they can bring in a lot more, where we can grow with them, and without you can't grow that much. It's also a higher focus on your own expertise. You remember, you ask yourself about your expertise and what is lacking, and this is what stakeholders have to bring in. And also you share risks and losses. Especially if you're an entrepreneur without means, it is important to be able to have someone else committing some resources, which also means you can share risks and losses because you don't lose everything on your own. So that's the second step, crafting stakeholder commitments, putting more people into that guild. And the last step is now thinking about how can I turn contingencies into new opportunities. So if something happens on the way, how can I make this an advantage for my company, for the market I'd like to create? And there's a couple examples for that. The first one is a guest in a restaurant complaining about the fried potatoes because he said they are too thick. I'd like to have smaller, thinner fried potatoes. And that was basically the starting point of chips. So a great invention, just by chance, a contingency because someone was complaining. Use that for your advantage. Second example, Percy Spencer. He had some chocolate in his pocket and he found out the chocolate melted because he was working close to a radar unit. And I thought, oh, how can I use radar to melt chocolate or to cook other things? And that was the beginning of the microwave. Again, by chance. A contingency he probably didn't like because the chocolate melted and maybe it was all dirty afterwards. But the positive thing was he got this idea. And the last example, many people know that example. Pfizer was working on a new drug that should cure heart diseases. It didn't really work out. However, it became very popular as Viagra and made Pfizer very, very successful at the very end. So also contingency, which could have been considered very negative because the initial plan didn't work out, but they turned it into something very positive for the whole company. And this is what you also should do. And what is the best way to do that? Well, if you try not to avoid surprises, and this is avoiding surprises. If you want to go from A to B and you block everything out, this means you avoid surprises. In case of Pfizer, they just would have thrown away the blue pill, which would have been a big mistake. And the other thing is, what you could do is you go not from A to B, but then you go from A to Y. So you use Viagra in order to sell it to other people instead of curing heart disease. So how do you do that? In these situations, just think about how you can turn the contingency into an advantage. There's also instruments for that, but maybe we should right now go over to look at your homework, at your first task. Your first task is closely associated to what I just told you, the effectual way of thinking and acting, and we'd like to start with this great example from RWTH Aachen University, the Streetscooter, and Achim Kamper. This is him. And the first question is, how did the whole thing start? So take the example of Streetscooter and analyze how its founder, Achim Kamper, a professor here, used his means to start the company. So describe each of the following questions in one sentence. Who is he? What does he know? Whom does he know? The main thing what you could do right now is do an internet search, try to understand him, his life, and so on, and try to get a sense for that situation. This is probably what you can do, and then you might understand why he was the one to build a Streetscooter. Next question is about partnerships. Who did help to succeed? It is very difficult if you should do that with the Streetscooter example because it's not all disclosed. Then it's easier to do that with another service or product. So please find one of service or product which you'd like to take that is delivered based on partnerships. So partnership, an important part in delivering this product or service. Those partners can be individuals or companies. Name the partners, describe their role in delivering the service and product, and by doing that, try to get an understanding why this product or service is possible only because of the partners, which then is a very, very good stakeholder commitment in that sense. So that's the second question. And the last question is about the contingencies, turning contingencies into opportunities. I gave you 3 examples, the chips, the microwave, and Viagra. So your task is to basically find more. So find 3 contingencies that individuals or companies have turned into new opportunities. Name the person, or if it's an individual or the company, who came across the contingency, and describe how the discovery occurred. And name the product they created or service they created. So don't use the one in the videos, try to think about others. And this is going to be probably very, very lively also for us to see which kind of examples you find. So I'm really looking forward to your solutions.